I'm Jill Hartz, the Executive Director of the museum, and I want to welcome many of you here that are with the Mackenzie River Trust Board of Directors and the Greenbelt Land Trust Board as well. We're delighted to have you here, and we look forward to working with you actually on an upcoming project, we hope. I also want to welcome our members and other visitors. Some of you may know that there was going to be a talk here by Kate Nicholson, and that just didn't work out. So we're delighted that you're happy to have a tour of American West as well. We think this is just a perfect show for Eugene and for us. As many of you know, National Geographic photographers are a breed of their own. And that almost all of the images in this show, when you look at them, you need to look at them with the idea that these photographers are taking full frame images. What you see is what they took, and they do not do Photoshop or any other kinds of alterations to the images. They spend their time setting up these images, which sometimes can be days and years to get the photograph they want. So I think that's always useful to understand that. And also, a lot of these photographs were produced before digital. Some of them are digital, but there's a lot here that are film photographs because this exhibition spans 125 years. So that's a short introduction, but I do want to introduce Joe Moll, who is the director of the Mackenzie River Trust.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll be brief. There's a pretty good group of Mackenzie River Trust folks here, both board, staff, volunteers, friends of the trust. We wanted to come and be a part of this for a couple of reasons. The Mackenzie River Trust as a land trust, hopefully many of you are aware of what we do. We protect and care for the special lands and the waters that flow through them in Western Oregon. That means we do real estate deals, we manage land for fish and wildlife habitat, recreation, clean water, things that are important to the people. We're a trust, a public trust. Perfect example of another trust that does mean so much to our community here is the wonderful resource we have here at the Schnitzer. For the last 5 years, the Mackenzie River Trust has sort of taken a step back from the day-to-day work that we do at least once a year for something called the Living River Festival, where we say, let's look at the work that we do from the perspective of the arts and humanities. Why do we value these places so much that we're willing to work to protect them for both our lifetime and lifetimes far beyond us? And so that's gotten us as an organization to broaden our scope a little bit. And we were thinking ahead, boy, wouldn't it be neat to do something out on the land on one of the properties where we have events in a big way, in an artistic way. And it just so happens that our friends down the river at Greenbelt Land Trust, similar mission downriver, had been thinking along similar lines. So we put our heads together and collectively started to imagine what might we do, not this year, not next year, but maybe 2015, that would put the upper Willamette Basin, at least, maybe the whole Willamette River, on the map as a place for a really intriguing art on the land event. And so the connections that we're starting to develop here with the folks at the Schnitzer are a step in that direction. So thanks for joining us, both those of you that are familiar with us and those that hopefully will learn a little bit about our work tonight.
Thank you. Two of our curators who will be giving the tour tonight after I give you some more introductions about the show. Danielle Knapp is our McCosh curator and works with the David McCosh collection and American art and all kinds of other things as well. And June Kohler is our assistant curator of American and European art. So we are setting up a program where you're going to walk through the show with us, and we'll be talking about different sections of it. But I wanted to begin with a quote that comes from this amazing book. I don't have a third hand. So, an amazing book, which is available in the store, but we're actually ordering more copies because they just keep disappearing. But this project began basically with Rich Clarkson. Some of you may have been here for his talk, but he was a National Geographic editor and has his own company and photography company, does a number of different things. But he actually called Christopher Johns, who's the chief editor of National Geographic, and who was actually an employee of his when he was at the Topeka newspaper, where many, many National Geographic and other photojournalists, photographers were trained. And he pitched to Chris the idea that a book on the American West would be wonderful, and could he have access to the archives of National Geographic? And Chris thought that was a fabulous idea. So then Rich turned around and called the magazine and publishing arm of National Geographic, and basically said, wouldn't it be great to have a book about it? And so what he says is he basically sold National Geographic's photographs back to National Geographic. They worried that this book was not going to be popular. They had done a survey among their members earlier and had come up with other themes, but the production times take a while, and by the time they put out those books, they actually weren't popular. But they said, well, we can do a limited run. This book is now in its third printing, and we'll have more as well. The book covers 125 years of photography, same as the show, but has many more photographs in it. And I wanted to read a portion of the introduction from the book, because James McNutt, who is the director of the National Museum of Wildlife Art in Jackson Hole and was the organizer of the show. And in fact, this show opened in 11 museums at the same time, all interested in wildlife, American West and wildlife, really to make a statement about how important the American West was. But he wrote a really inspiring essay in the catalog, and it is, you'll have to see it when our camera moves, but it's right behind you, and it's a stereograph that was created by William Henry Jackson in 1873, and it's in fact the first image of the Mountain of the Holy Cross. And I think what he says about it kind of sets the tone for this exhibition. On August 23, 1873, photographer William Henry Jackson and his team of assistants, 16 people and a great number of mules, labored up a valley strewn with fallen timber, slick rocks and bogs west of the Eagle River in Colorado, seeking a route to a view of the legendary Mountain of the Holy Cross. Leaving the valley, Jackson took 2 members of the team and ascended a ridge to a vantage point on Notch Mountain. After a restless night at Treeline, they arrived to a clear, cold morning and a sunrise view of the snow-crossed mountain. Jackson had to wait for snowmelt to produce the water needed to wash his glass plates. Then he made 8 images, the first ever of the Mountain of the Holy Cross. His stereographs and prints, slightly altered to extend one arm of the cross, became one of the most popular photographs of the American West in the 19th century, symbolizing to many the union of America, nature, and God that filled a romantic destiny. Proving a legend, Jackson's photography helped bequeath to future generations a sense of the American West as an enormous natural territory in which to explore national and human possibilities. So this is probably the only photograph in the exhibition that has been altered. So it actually has a cross instead of like one arm, and for the purposes mentioned. And there's another one that we can talk about Edward Curtis as well, which is probably a setup shot. But other than that, I think what you see is what you get even when they look like they must be set up, but they're not. I think the themes that he mentioned in terms of God, America, nature, resonate in all of these works, and certainly probably for all of us in one way or another. At this point, 125 years ago, what many of these photographers and explorers of the West were doing was testing their own potential. Could they live and explore the West? Could they go into the unknown and survive? Could they survive nature? But also with National Geographic, what it was aiming to do, not only to show the grandeur of the West, but to instill an idea that this pristine land needed to be preserved. And so National Geographic, as in many other areas of the country, has been dedicated to doing its best to develop a love of the West so that we all want to preserve it. So I think that's an interesting perspective to keep in mind as you go through this show, and especially as you see some of the more recent images which show the use of the land. So the exhibition, which Danielle and June will take you through, has 4 sections other than the short introduction here. Legends, which will be over here, and you can kind of see it by the iconic images, captures kind of the idea of the West, whether it's the cowboy from movies or the rugged cowboy that has to brand and do other things on the land. And then it moves into encounters within peoples, both the explorers and native populations, the encounters among animals, with animals, and the land itself. And then it goes to boundaries. Come on in. And boundaries is both man-made boundaries and natural boundaries, and what those mean both within our own minds and within the world that we have. And then it ends with visions. And visions is kind of a way of looking at what we're doing with the West now and what we'd like to do with it. And I think that all of these sections are kind of fluid. Some of these works could go into any section, but it gives us kind of a nice framework in which to look at the show and how they divided it up. So this section here is our intro, and you can see an Ansel Adams photograph behind you, one of the first about that just shows the grandeur of the West, which has become, iconic images and Ansel Adams associated with that, and other just amazing, amazing pictures of the landscape. And then over in the corner over here, the Native Americans with the pots on their heads is an Edward Curtis, one of the earliest works in the show too. And it's probably not something that Edward Curtis just found, coming through. He probably, they may well have had walked with pots on their heads, but often what Curtis did was recreate an old Native America that no longer existed. So that one probably is a little bit doctored in the sense of how it was set up. But it's also interesting, you might think this is an old photograph too, but it's not. It's someone that's referencing back. And then this one, with all of the documentation around it, is an actual portrait. It's, you can see that it is. What Sam Abel mentioned when he was taking us through the show, and he has 2 works in this, is that now what's interesting among photographers is that while you have all the greatest opportunities with digital photography, a lot of photographers, and especially young photographers, are interested in the old processes. So they're going back to whether it's stereographs or ambrotypes or other kinds of techniques, and spending that time developing themselves at the same time as we are on the cusp of 3D photography. So just as we have that in films now, very soon it's going to become commonplace in photography. So imagine what that's going to be like. So I'm going to turn this over to June, I think, or no, Danielle. So she's going to take us into legends.
So I apologize, with such a large group, we'll all have to kind of move together as we work through this space. I'm going to start briefly talking about this image, and then I'll move over to that wall, so if you want to situate. And so the most memorable project like that for him was traveling to the ranch where famous cowboy illustrator in Montana, Charles M. Russell, had lived. And so on the land here, he's photographing cowboys going about the day-to-day tasks. Here they are branding and castrating cattle on the farm. And he talked about all that went into setting up the perfect opportunity for this image to happen, the observational skills that had been nurtured over a lifetime, a career that he was finally tuning these skills, and recognizing first and foremost in this image that the background allowed him to have an opportunity to maybe get that perfect shot. It wasn't cluttered with the cowboys' trucks or buildings or things that might distract the eye. He found this front framework very interesting, particularly this cowboy with his red shirt and his tattered jacket. So he thought, okay, so this is providing the foreground that is interesting to me. And then it was just a matter of carefully waiting and observing for the opportunity to get a shot that had all of that the dynamic quality of what was actually happening in place. And so he was watching these cowboys, he was watching as this figure approached, and he said as he was waiting to snap the photos of this, he was watching this figure with the bucket walking across the land, swinging the bucket. So just over a couple of seconds this occurred, and he was asking himself, bucket in or bucket out? What do I want to commit to? And we think he made the right decision. But one thing that was really interesting to me that really ties into this theme of legends that we start with is how he mentioned that had this figure who walked into the background at precisely the right moment, this cowboy on his horse, had he not had his head raised, had the horse's head not been raised above that horizon line, he never even would have shown it to anyone. Because to him, as a photographer, he thinks one of the most important things you're doing when you're photographing someone, if you're creating a portrait, whether posed or not, is to elevate the figure above the landscape, to give them dignity, to have them stand above that horizon line. And so that really ties into the idea of legends in this space, thinking about who are the people, the personalities you associate with this idea of the American West, and not just people, all of whom might seem larger than life, but for National Geographic, this is all grounded in reality. They were photographing real people. They are preserving and documenting something authentic. And so it might seem larger than life because our collective consciousness has built up this idea of the American West, largely informed by real-time photographs that have been distributed by National Geographic. But we want to really recognize that they're not manipulated. They are true-to-life images. And not just the people represented, but what else are the legends of the West? The animals, when you think of the American buffalo, the bison, if you think of the land itself, these are legends that are real. So we'll just walk around the corner here, and I'll point out another image that's really interesting, which is this photograph from 1921 by Charles Martin, who in that same decade had become the first chief of National Geographic's photo lab. And he had traveled to Mesa Verde in Colorado to photograph the Anasazi cliff dwellings. So you might be familiar with these if you've traveled throughout the Southwest. The story of the Anasazi people is very well known, even though a lot of mystery remains around this culture. The name is actually taken from a Navajo word meaning ancient ones or ancient enemy. But it's really a problematic term, and it's an archaeologist term. It's not a term representing the culture that had lived in these places. This is one of the most famous locations where their dwellings remain, and they built cliff dwellings out of sandstone and wood that could only be accessed by ropes or by rock climbing, which of course provided, in terms of security, a great benefit, but was also problematic and may have been one of the factors that contributed in people migrating out of these areas and leaving them abandoned in the 13th century. So they've been abandoned for an extraordinarily long time. And the area was rediscovered in the 1870s, 1880s. There was a gold prospector who had first viewed some of these dwellings, who actually then invited the same photographer who took that first photo Jill talked about with the cross on the mountain to come and photograph the images. And so this is 30, 40 years after people from the east started to take notice of these spaces. And just to sort of put the timing of this in context, Lewis and Clark, their expedition was at the turn of the century, the early 1800s. Oregon became a state in 1859. National Geographic began publishing photos, I think, in the 1870s in their magazine. And Yosemite became the first national park around that time. So by 1920, when Charles Martin was taking photos of this, there was already a lot of interest in trying to study and document these cultures, the remnants of the cultures. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence in not just this area, which is one of the most famous. It's 150 rooms, so it's a particularly large settlement called the Cliff Palace. And as we wrap up, when we get to the other end, I'll mention something else about the Anasazi. Did you want to say something about this wall, Jenny?
Do I need this for the recording as well? No? Okay. Okay, so as Jill and Danielle mentioned, there are 4 categories in this exhibition. I'm going to be talking about images from the Encounters and Boundaries section. So one of the things that I think this show does very thoughtfully is talk about the encounters between distinct people groups, between people and animals, and between people and the land. So this photograph is of Yellowstone's Grand Prismatic Spring. And it's the largest hot spring in the United States. It's 250 by 300 feet. And one of the things that I think is most fascinating about this image, aside from just the really wonderful colors that you see here, is this little line that snakes across the bottom here, that's the trail in Yellowstone, and you can see just how small the figures are in relation to this really incredible natural element. Another thing that I think is really significant is the use of aerial photography here. And I'm going to be talking about a number of pieces that were shot aerially. As Danielle mentioned, National Geographic started publishing in the 1870s before a lot of aerial photography was possible. So that Mountain of the Holy Cross, you see it from another mountain pass that's in front of it. But later, as aerial photography becomes possible, you see these things that you just really can't experience on the ground. So I really enjoy this image for that reason. And we're going to go just right over here to another photograph by Sam Abel that I think is also particularly significant because it was taken from the air. So in the photograph that we saw of the branding in Montana, this was taken on that same trip. As Danielle mentioned, Sam Abel was very interested in sort of following the footsteps of significant individuals. So this is that same Charlie Russell trip. And he told the story of how he made the helicopter pilot just sort of go over and over this area so that he could get that perfect shot. And if any of you came to Sam's talk, you remember his focus on composition and how important he felt it was to wait for sort of that decisive moment. Another thing that he likes to point out about this image is that it's not the setting sun, it's actually the rising moon. And just in case any of you are lunar photographers, Sam suggests that it's actually better to take a photograph depicting the full moon a few days before. If you wait until it's actually a full moon, the light will be too bright and it'll sort of ruin your photograph. So just a little tidbit for any photographers out there. This is also in Montana. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to move just around this wall over here. Okay, so that last image that we looked at of Sam's was from the 1980s. This image was from the 1940s, but it's also an aerial image as well. This was taken in California, in the northern desert area. These are the Blythe geoglyphs or pictograms. So one of the things that's really amazing about this photograph is that it's showing these glyphs, which were created at least 3,000 years ago, potentially longer ago than that. But they were made by the Mojave Indians in such a way, they were so shallow and they were so large that you can't see them except from above. So what they did was, this is a very gravelly desert area, and they sort of swept off the darker rocks on top and exposed lighter rocks underneath. But as I said, it's just so shallow that you can't see these images unless you're above. So even though they're several thousand years old, they weren't even known about by non-native peoples until the 1930s. So this photograph was taken about 10 years after they were discovered, which again, as both Danielle and Jill have pointed out, one of the things that National Geographic is best known for are these real-time images. So as things are being discovered, so to speak, or at least discovered by non-native peoples, National Geographic was one of the biggest proponents of sort of the wonders of the West. And as we talk about boundaries and encounters, I think it's important to point out that National Geographic was really looking to protect these lands. They were involved with lawmakers, actually throughout the century really, to make sure that these lands were preserved. So just during the Teddy Roosevelt administration, there was something like 150 national parks that were created, federal lands dedicated to preserving areas for birds and other wildlife. So National Geographic played a really huge role in that. We're going to, oh yeah, absolutely. It's not on.
Whoops, it's off. Okay. My voice may not be quite as loud as June's. But these three are three of my favorite photographs in the show, and I just want to point to them because this one relates to nature. I mean, it relates to things that you cannot control. I mean, these are they're obviously looking at the storm that's coming and how that's going to affect their livelihood. And a beautiful shot anyway, but also knowing that there are things you can't control, whether it's the big storms or the fires that are coming through. And in case right behind you, you think that's a fire, just you'll have to read the title. It's not. It's actually lights and dust at a rodeo. So first impressions may not be what really are. But I also want to point to these two when we're talking about boundaries, because obviously at the top they're creating a fence that's going to keep cattle in. And on the bottom what they're doing is having created a fence to keep Mexicans out, which I think that's a telling way of how we're using or misusing the land.
Okay, so I want to talk about two more pieces down here in the boundaries section. This is one of the most remarkable images in the exhibition to me. I think it's actually compositionally quite lovely, just in terms of the elements of art that you see here. With the construction that's depicted, you get a lot of these really stark lines. And then with the natural forms, you see all these very organic curves. So on the one hand, it's sort of lovely, but then when you look and see what it is, it's very disturbing. This, of course, is the recent construction over the Hoover Dam to make this bridge to relieve traffic flow in the area. But of course, everyone, I'm sure many of you have been to the Hoover Dam, seen it as a child, et cetera, et cetera. The Colorado River is such a beloved river in this country, but sort of because of the fascination and because, of increased people moving into the West, it's been very overtapped. So this river that, has for years and years and years been such a source of fascination actually doesn't make it to the ocean anymore. It dries out before it even gets there, which is pretty tragic. I just think this is a very poignant image. And I also like this curved horizon line in the background. It's sort of unsettling, which I think is a nice compositional trick to coincide with the subject of the piece. And this is another image that I, again, at once really enjoy and find unsettling. My family is from Alaska, and one of the things I like to do when I'm home is hike glaciers. And even in the last several years, I've noticed that my favorite glaciers that I like to go and visit have diminished significantly. This image is from Glacier National Park in Montana. And in the catalog that accompanies the exhibition, there's some really nice discussion of what's been happening with climate change and how that's in particular been impacting the West. And one of the things that I think people sort of misunderstand about climate change is, they think it's happened very recently, but as long ago as the late 19th century, National Geographic was publishing things about the glaciers shrinking and diminishing. And there's this beautiful quote about them sort of being these giants that are shriveling away. So this is a really lovely but sad image that you should come and check out. I'm sorry to leave you all on that point, but I'm going to hand it back over to Danielle now, who's going to talk about visions. Oh, you don't need this. You want it? Okay.
I never think people can hear me as well as I think I can. Yeah. Okay. So the vision section, the fourth of the sections in this show, talks about, brings to mind a couple of different things related to National Geographic. And when we think of visions, we might think of how the images inspire people to explore the West, how it inspires the imagination when thinking about the West, but also a vision for the future in both conservation of the land, in both in terms of technology that's happening. And so on this wall, there's two images I wanted to point out. And the first is a more contemporary image of one of the Anasazi settlements that's in New Mexico. This is from 1988, but still more recent than the 1921 photograph we looked at. And this is a time-lapse photograph of the stars moving over an Anasazi observatory in New Mexico. It's a beautiful image. And then this image is of the Salton Sea in California's Imperial Valley. And if you're not familiar with this geographic location, and I wasn't, and reading about it, I'm really shocked that I had never known about it before. So you may be already more familiar with it than I was. But This is the largest lake in California, and it's an area that since prehistory, because of its low sea level, had changed the level of the water, sometimes being fresh water, sometimes being seawater, due to flooding, due to environmental factors. In 1905, though, the Colorado River flooded it so greatly that engineers were unable to stop the flooding. Their canals were flooded, and so much water moved into this area, which I think is about 500 square miles, that it remained a puddle in the landscape to this day. It has never since dried up and then refilled as it had for millennia and millennia. And so as a result of that, it certainly created a change in the ecosystem here. This is actually one of the major stops for migrating birds who are traveling south. But it's a saltwater lake that is the salt concentration is so high that it's higher than the Pacific Ocean, though not as high as Great Salt Lake. But over time, due to several things that have happened in this location, including other attempts to change the water flow. At one point it was a resort town, so it was being heavily used by vacationers on the lake. It's also suffered from a lot of runoff from agricultural chemicals in the area. It's now becoming a dead zone for biodiversity. Over 400 species of birds have been documented traveling through there, but now the fish, the water life in it no longer is existing. And there's such a stench from the algae and from the decay of what had been in the water, from things that have tried to live in the salt water, that it has a very off-putting scent to the area. But it's a beautiful image and a beautiful place and an important place. And I think that that sounds all very depressing. California has been trying to enact ways to conserve it, ways to approach the problem of how to maintain this area and not let it become a complete dead zone for wildlife. But I think it's really promising that National Geographic and other people are paying attention to a place like this, that are documenting it, they're sharing those images, hopefully inspiring further concern for its future. And so I think that when we talk about visions and what National Geographic and these types of images are able to provide to the public, I think there's a really positive opportunity for us to be further inspired to preserve such places and to study them. And so I think those are the images we'd selected to talk about. We're happy to answer questions too. Do you have more to say?
I just wanted to let you know about a couple others. One is the spotted owl, and all know the spotted owl. And you may be wondering how that photograph could have been taken, because it wasn't someone who was just sitting in the bush waiting for an owl, but they actually were able to set up a camera that would take pictures based on quacks. No, based on movement. So the camera would automatically take pictures based on activity that was happening near it. So the photographer didn't really know what he would capture until he went back and saw what was on the film, or in this case on a digital camera. So that's only something that could have been done because of modern technology. And it's an amazing photograph. When you think of visions, we think of owls too. And then on this back wall, which we kind of think of as our sci-fi corner, but it's not like the West is sci-fi. But to me, it kind of looks that way from a distance. You have the wind turbines on the left. So this is kind of an energy section. This is how the West is being exploited in some ways because of the great solar power and wind that we have that can create this energy. So, and I think just an unbelievably gorgeous, weird image. You have the wind turbines on the left. Next to them, where the American flag is, that's a big oil refinery that they've covered up with, not covered up, but they put a big flag on the front of it. And right below that are solar panels. Just a huge, huge number of solar panels. And then on the left where you see a laser, there are two lasers going up that are actually creating the image of a star. So it's like now we can create stars too. So I think it's a nice note to end on in terms of, well, we can create nature as well. At least as someone there thought they could. So as Danielle said, this was a really quick look through the show. I don't know if you have questions. We're happy to answer any. Yeah. Okay, well, you know, we'll stick around and talk and just take
Is it on other?
It's all, everything is here except for one small photograph, which is right outside the gallery. which is of, I think, a mining shop, right? So, you know, there are images in here, like right behind us, which looks like a painting with the green, this beautiful green and this rust color. That's clear cutting. You know, so you look at these things, as June said, you look at these images that are breathtaking, and then you actually look at them and you see what some of this is about. But there's only one image outside of this. So thank you so much for coming. Take time looking through the show. I think it's next Wednesday. If you're interested in photography, then the three of us will be taking visitors through the rest of the museum, looking at other photographs that are in our collection. So that'll be an interesting tour as well. So we invite you to come back and to linger here. So thank you again.